the first movie studio was Vitagraph, and it's set up in New York. Actually, these guys had an office in Manhattan around the turn of the century, the turn into the 20th century. And then they made a studio in Brooklyn. And there were a lot of people shooting short films. There was Edison. But Vitagraph actually had like a studio where you could work inside, but the ones that are really famous, they're exteriors. And they decamped around 1910, took off for California, better weather, never looked back. But at the same time, Edison was sending little film crews into New York. And what I always find interesting about looking at these films now is you see the 3-minute film then made in exactly the same place and sometimes not looking so very different than a contemporary film. So you have, say, there's a very short film that was made in Herald Square, and you have James Nares, who's a painter and was an underground filmmaker in the 1970s and has gone back to film and making these really museum installations. And he has this great film called Street, which is a slow-mo film made with the Phantom. And he shoots in the identical place as that first little Herald Square film. Hollywood created the image and the fantasy and the myth of New York without ever shooting a frame of film here. And that was true, really, for most of film history until the late 40s. There were various reasons. I mean, the studios set up in California supposedly because of the weather, and that had something to do with it. You tend to think when you read the history that the studios that, in quotes, the creative people wanted to be as far away from the financial people who were in New York as possible. And whole sound stages were built that were used in film after film, that were single blocks and city streets and upscale blocks. And, you know, there's that incredible recreation of Pennsylvania Station in The Clock. But at the same time, certain films came to get, say, opening shots in New York. Certain kinds of iconic shots that the one that I always remember because I was training to be a singer, and I was training at the Juilliard when I was very, very young. And my parents regularly took me to the ballet and the opera. And so I went to see On the Town in theaters. And On the Town was a ballet originally that I had seen on the stage. And it was absolutely clear in this film that they were actually on the Brooklyn Bridge doing that opening number, that it wasn't a matte shot and it wasn't a fake Brooklyn Bridge. And if you lived in New York and you lived in New York all your life, you could tell the difference. The Naked City was, if it wasn't absolutely the first studio feature shot in New York in 1948, it was one of the first. And I think that the desire to do that, to shoot on location in New York, came out of a couple of factors. One was the Second World War. And one of the things that happened during the Second World War is that people were going to theaters and seeing newsreels. And they were getting used to seeing the real thing, verisimilitude. Um, and so that idea of making a film in the actual city, so you would see it like you actually saw London and you actually saw Rome, very importantly. So you would actually see this urban capital. I think there was a desire for that. The other factor, of course, was in Italy after the Second World War, you had the rise of neorealism. And neorealism grew out of several factors. One, there were no film studios. And during the Second World War, I mean, there was a certain amount of bombing out, but there was very little electricity. You couldn't light on a sound stage. And so the neo-realists, out of necessity, began shooting on the street.
Ladies and gentlemen, the motion picture you are about to see is called The Naked City.
When I took a look at it the other night again, there were two things that are very striking. One, there's almost nothing in the city that looks the same as in this film. I mean, it's extraordinary because the things that they were shooting, for the most part, they weren't shooting icons. They weren't shooting the Statue of Liberty. They weren't shooting particularly the Empire State Building, but they were shooting the skyline from above in an airplane, and that skyline is totally altered now. The other really important influence on The Naked City is Ouija, and Ouija's photographs of crime scenes in New York. A tremendous influence on how the crime in Naked City is investigated, what happens when the detectives come into the crime scene. All of that is very much derived from New York City still photography. They came to New York with really no support system here. They were a Hollywood studio who flew in their crew and their lights and everything to make this production. And they improvised a soundstage, I think on 26th Street, that had been there from the very early days, but there was nothing really to use. And it was, however, right around this time, right around the late 40s and the early 50s, that you had the growth of television. And television took roots in New York. You began to have actually a union of television employees who could shoot film and who became the second union that New York relied on in 1960. So you began to have the beginning of an infrastructure to make films here. The other thing that happened slightly later was that you had the development in the late 50s of certain kinds of cameras. The camera setup, the sync sound, 16 millimeter cameras that were used for cinema verite documentary. Morris Engel, who was a still photographer, who made The Little Fugitive, commissioned a 35 millimeter silent camera that he could handhold. Morris Engel was a colleague of Helen Levitt, also a great New York photographer, and Helen Levitt and Janice Loeb and the film critic James Agee had made this short film in 1948 in the street, which kind of opened, the idea that you would go into what was then Spanish Harlem and shoot on the street this extraordinary film, which was daily life and largely kids on this one block. And all that was the beginning of people being able to see that it was possible to shoot here and not be involved with the studios. I mean, to shoot here because you were a documentarian, because you were an underground filmmaker, but even, as Morris Engel did, to make feature films here. Pick up on South Street for me, this is very personal experience. My grandmother was movie mad. She actually never learned to read and write in English. She came in 1905, and when her siblings and her cousins went to night school, she went to the movies. I mean, she was totally addicted to the movies. From the time I was 2, she carried me into movie theaters. I mean, I guess I was a placid baby and I didn't cry and scream a lot, but that's when I started watching movies. But the first movie that I ever saw that gave me a sense of what movies could really do, and that they had something to do with sex and with something illicit, was Sam Fuller's Pick Up on South Street, which I saw by that time. You know, they'd drop you. This was New York in the 50s, and parents would simply drop their kids at the movies and say, stay all day. And so they dropped me, and I just went to see everything. And I saw this movie, and I was totally ravished by it. And the only thing I wanted to do was to find out if South Street really existed in New York, and if it was shot there, and could I find the street? And of course, I wasn't allowed to go around the city on the subway by myself. So I actually never did, and I think before I would have found South Street itself, I realized that Sam Fuller had shot this, not in the South Street seaport of New York, but elsewhere. This leads to the beginning of my relationship to New York underground movies, which I started seeing with my husband-to-be then, and my then husband, Richard Foreman, the experimental playwright and theater maker. And we went to underground movies all the time. I mean, it was obsessive and ritualistic. We had gone to art films before, and then we really got involved with the American avant-garde. And we were very shy. We almost talked to no one. But we would turn up, and really in those days there were 10 people in theaters for, you say, well, how many people were there to see Andy Warhol's Kiss? Well, there were 8 people other than us, and there was us. And Ken Jacobs, the great avant-garde filmmaker who has documented New York in his work for over 60 years now, was the projectionist at this cinematheque that moved from theater to theater. And Kenneth and his wife, Flo, invited us to their loft to see movies. And their loft was on Ferry Street, which actually no longer exists either. If South Street ever existed, it doesn't exist, and Ferry Street no longer exists, but it was pretty close to where South Street would have been. And Kenneth was making films there. He also invited us that night to see films by the teenage Kuchar brothers, George and Mike Kuchar, who were making fiction films using their friends and family from the Bronx and picturesque Bronx locations in their work. Something happens really in the middle 50s. This is a very, very, very small world, the world of people who want to make independent documentaries, the people who are already making avant-garde films, like Gregory Markopoulos, and just a little bit later, Ken Jacobs, and the great Joseph Cornell and Stan Brakhage. and Kenneth Anger, although he's still on the West Coast. And they are, that's the world of avant-garde films. But some of them, like Jonas Mekas and Robert Frank, the great still photographer, have an ambition to make narrative films. And which is not you just pick up your 8mm or 16mm, but you might need lights and you might need sound, and they are attempting to do this totally independently. So you had Morris Engel making Little Fugitive at the end of the 50s, but you also had Robert Frank and, at that point, his teammate, Alfred Leslie, making Pull My Daisy, which was a beat home movie. And very importantly, you had John Cassavetes, an actor who had the ambition to direct a film, making Shadows, which is a narrative feature film shot on location in New York, in Times Square, in rehearsal studios in New York, on the Upper West Side, in jazz clubs, the whole New York shebang. So among the filmmakers who were beginning to work in the late 1950s and were incredibly important to both underground and independent feature filmmaking in New York, I think Shirley Clarke was one of the most important. And, you know, for a long time, her work was almost unknown. She made these kind of polite shorts, a film of the Brooklyn Bridge, a film that was nominated for an Academy Award that she made with two other people about the building of 666 Fifth Avenue. But she really wanted to make much more films about subcultures. And her first important feature was she just filmed the Living Theater's production of The Connection, the Jack Gelber play about a bunch of drug addicts waiting for their connection. And that's an extraordinary film. And 2 years later, in 1963, she made the first fiction film shot in its entirety in Harlem, The Cool World, which is just a major piece of independent filmmaking. Things really took off very slowly from there. But you also had in the 60s the rise of New York film schools, particularly NYU. And for example, Martin Scorsese went to NYU Film School, and he had the ambition to be a narrative feature filmmaker. He was enormously influenced by seeing Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising, which was one of the major works of the American avant-garde. And shot on location in New York, starring a then New York City cab driver, Scorpio, and shot in back rooms and in little apartments, and about a gay motorcycle gang, essentially. And what Anger did was he used, great hits of Motown girl groups. Didn't pay for rights or anything, just used them in the films, synced them up. And Scorsese saw that, and he said it changed everything for him. It made him realize that you didn't have to score a film with music made especially for the film, but the idea of using entire cuts, like the entire cut that begins Mean Streets, was something that he had never thought of before Kenneth Anger. And so at film school, he made his first film and made it in New York on location, Who's That Knocking at My Door? And that's a film that hardly anyone ever sees, so most people think Mean Streets was Scorsese's first film, but by then he had gone to live in LA, and actually Mean Streets, which is a consummate New York film, he only shot in New York 3 days. He shot the Feast of San Gennaro and a little bit under the elevator on that was the West Side Highway. And that was it for New York. Otherwise, it was LA as New York. In the 60s, the image of New York on film was being created in the underground. And of course, in addition to Kenneth Anger and people who are, to a certain degree, less well known, like Gregory Markopoulos, there are three really important people. There's Jack Smith, who shot Flaming Creatures in a loft on Grand Street. You had the beginning of this really downtown secret art scene, and on a roof and in a loft, and roofs were used a lot. And this was a really quite extraordinary scene. It was the scene of transvestite performers. But you also had Andy Warhol, in part inspired by Jack Smith, beginning to shoot movies. And Warhol, if you look back at those some 400 films that Warhol made, they really are a history of New York in that period. Not that he shot exteriors very much, although he did iconically make a film of the Empire State Building from sunset to sunrise. But the people who lived in New York and were made in quotes, this incredible Warhol scene, which was uptown and downtown, and rich people and poor people, and drug addicts and hookers and debutantes and everything, came together in Warhol's factory. And the films are not really about the landscape of New York. Warhol's factory, the interior, became this sound stage that stood for New York in that period. The other great filmmaker of New York in the 60s was Jonas Mekas. And very few people knew that Jonas, who was, the father and the godfather of avant-garde film, who created an infrastructure so there were not just isolated people who would make one or two films and then say, well, they'll go in my closet and now I have to do something seriously, but so that dozens, hundreds of people were walking around New York in the 60s with their Super 8 cameras or their 16 millimeter cameras, making diaries and shooting their girlfriends and their dogs and everything else. I mean, it was a very active filmmaking scene. And Jonas, who was busy raising money for everyone else and setting up the Filmmakers Cinematheque and later Anthology Film Archives and the Filmmakers Co-op, whoever thought, after his first two attempts, that he had continued making films. He made a film, a narrative sync-sound feature in 1959. Didn't work too well, Guns of the Trees. He made a film of the Living Theater's production of The Brig. And then everyone thought that he had stopped. But actually, he was walking around with his camera shooting from the hips. And around 1966, he got a commission to please deliver a film to us. And he began editing the New York diaries that he had been keeping since he arrived in 1946. And those are now some of the greatest works that document New York City. And Jonas walked around outside. He was not only an inside guy. He was an exterior guy. So in films like Diaries, Notebooks, and Sketches, and Lost, Lost, Lost in particular, you have a whole history of the New York art and film scene, but also an immigrant scene, the Lithuanian immigrants. Jonas was from Lithuania, and that immigrant community was a large part of his base, and he had begun shooting them as early as 1946. So that's a whole other history of New York that's there. Then what happens is, I think because Warhol has such extraordinary presence in media, a film like Midnight Cowboy, coming to shoot in New York, it's really shooting in Warhol territory, and with characters modeled on people who would turn up at the factory. And actually, if you look at the DVD extras of Midnight Cowboy, you can see long sequences. They recruited all these underground superstars from the factory to be in Midnight Cowboy. And while Hollywood was never interested in Warhol, he was certainly interested in Hollywood. And Hollywood was interested in using him in a particular way, although they were never interested in financing him. The 70s, there still is this kind of split between the underground and then what would become, the independent film movement. A then very young guy from Britain, James Nares, came to New York and began making films. He was largely making films and videos and photographs and playing music. James really documented, without thinking he was documenting this, he made a lot of films down in what is now Tribeca, and what was then just a wasteland of buildings that that artists were really squatting in and using for studio space, and there was barely running water. And the West Side Highway down there was nothing there. And you look at those films today, and it is an extraordinary history of New York. Then there were Super 8 filmmakers. There was the amazing Vivian Dick, who came here maybe for 4 years from Ireland, and she's back living in Ireland. And she made this amazing Super 8 narrative film called She Had Her Gun Already, starring 2 stars of the punk music scene, Pat Place and Lydia Lunch, as symbiotic friends who just can't stand the sight of each other. And at one point, Pat goes up on the roof of a building over in Tribeca, and there is an airplane passing so low over the Twin Towers that to see it now is just extraordinary. There was Betty Gordon, who made a great feature film which had a lot of play in Europe and is available now in all over the world on DVD and narrative feature, which immortalized the porn center of New York then, 42nd Street, and was actually about a young woman who worked in the ticket booth of a porn theater. She did not use a theater in Times Square. She used the amazing Variety Theater on 3rd Avenue and 13th Street before it came down. And that theater, just vanished without that film. So those films were very, very, very important. Catherine Bigelow, who started making films in New York when she was thinking that she was going to be a painter, made her first 16 millimeter film here. It was called The Setup, and she shot it in an alley just behind what was then the most outrageous club in downtown, the Mud Club. So that's a kind of alternate history. At the same time, people were coming to New York in the late 70s. You had an unmarried woman shot on the block where I live. Suddenly, all over the place, people were shooting in Soho. You know, actually, Jill Clayborg vomits into a wastepaper basket on my corner. That was extraordinary to see that. A real wastepaper basket that was there day after day, not a wastepaper basket, a garbage basket. And from the end of the 70s through to today, you have film crews all over New York all the time. By the time you get to 1980, it's no longer an issue, can you make films in New York? Of course you can make films in New York. You have a huge talent pool that wants to work. You have still cheap rent and people who want to make movies living here. And you still have these three strata of film. You have the people coming in from the West Coast to shoot movies here. You have independent film of varying budget size, but the independent film movement is really, really coming into its own. And you still have, underground films and people making films for no money. But what really gains momentum in the 80s is what we now think of as independent film. I mean, independent film goes way, 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 way back, really, to the beginning of film. And certainly you have Cassavetes from the end of the 50s and a couple of other people. But by the time you get to the mid-80s, there are all kinds of people, most of them graduating from film school, who want to make features. And really the two signature works, I think, of the mid-80s that in New York are Jim Jarmusch making Stranger Than Paradise, very much influenced by Robert Frank's Pull My Daisy way back then in '59, and by Frank's still photos. And you have Spike Lee, almost at the same moment, making She's Gotta Have It. Jarmusch has gone all over the map to make work. He, far more films outside of New York than in New York. But Spike Lee is really a New York filmmaker. He is the consummate Brooklyn filmmaker. And so you have Do the Right Thing, and you have Crooklyn, and you have the basketball film that's shot in Red Hook, and later Red Hook Summer, and other people shooting in Red Hook. There is a whole iconography involved with low-rent housing complex, the Gowanus houses and Red Hook housing complex that other filmmakers come into as well as Spike. And so you begin to have this iconography of Brooklyn. And these days, Brooklyn is where people go to shoot, chic movies, upscale movies, come in from Hollywood. They don't come to Soho anymore, even Tribeca. They go to Brooklyn Heights and Park Slope. But if you ever want to see the reality of the gap between the ultra-rich and the poor in New York City, you go to the movies to see that, and you go to independent films largely to see that. By the end of the 80s, it was all here. It was no longer an issue, can I shoot in New York? Of course I can shoot in New York. Do I want to shoot in New York? Yes, of course I want to shoot in New York. Indeed, there started being sound stages in New York, used largely for television series, but not entirely. Coming back to really the 90s into the first decade of this century that we are in now, the 21st century. Um, Again, you have filmmakers shooting in New York if it's appropriate. So you have Steven Soderbergh making his independent film, The Girlfriend Experience, here in New York and immortalizing some really high-end, extremely tacky restaurants and places over on in Chelsea and on the East Side, and contemporary loft living. And you also have side effects, a much bigger budgeted film, but not a hugely budgeted film, shooting on the Upper West Side and immortalizing that skyline as it still exists, pretty much unchanged from the beginning of the 20th century, and those wonderful Upper West Side apartments, very few of which exist anymore. Now, to make films about New York, you basically make films about Wall Street. You make films about bankers. You make, and you know, this has become a city of, especially Manhattan and Brooklyn, extremely wealthy people. And you shoot the power base of, to the extent that it exists, and it is not digitally disembodied. There is still a basis, and it is Lower Manhattan. So the Safdie brothers are independent filmmakers, and they've made 3 features and some shorts, largely on the Lower East Side. And this film is made exactly where Panic in Needle Park was made in 1971. And it is a movie about kids, heroin addicts, living almost below the radar, although they think they're the most important people on earth, on the Upper West Side, in Riverside Park, in Central Park, along those streets, holed up in basements. It is an extraordinary film. It's not a documentary, it's a fiction film. And it's based on the young woman who plays the lead. It's her memoirs, and it's a love story. A love story about an impossible love of her for this other junkie who probably doesn't love her as much as he loves his junk. But it is an amazing, again, film about the city that when people look at it, they're going to say, oh, I didn't know those people were still there, hiding out in our basement or whatever. The same people that were there in Panic in Needle Park in the 70s. So movies keep recreating the image of the city, but it's not an image that isn't there. It's not a phony image. Movies keep capturing kind of what we don't even see. I mean, movies keep capturing what we are, we walk around with blinders on. And every now and then there are movies that open your eyes to the city you live in. And that's a great thing.